I noticed the tracks before I saw her. Fresh, deep prints on top of last night's powder, wide as my palm, cutting across the service road behind the pines. Then I saw the smaller marks beside them, two sets, messy and sliding where the snow crust broke. Cubs dot in these mountains. Winter doesn't forgive mistakes. The wind funnels through the ravines like a blade, and the nights pull the heat out of anything that breathes. A jaguar family does not belong here in January. Not with storms stacking up and the creek frozen solid. The tracks were heading toward the old Miller property, the one everyone calls Walter's place. Walter Miller was the kind of man who waved once a month and spoke even less. He didn't waste words, and he didn't waste effort. His cabin sat back from the road, half hidden by spruce. That morning the sky had that hard, white look that warns you the temperature is dropping again. I stopped at the edge of his clearing and listened. Nothing moved except the trees creaking under snow. Then I heard it, a rough breath being forced through a tight chest. I didn't step closer. I stood behind a trunk and watched the shape under fallen branches by Walter's woodpile. She was real. The jaguar mother lifted her head, slow, like every motion cost her something. Snow clung to the fur along her spine. Her sides rose and fell too fast, and her eyes kept shifting to two small bodies pressed against her belly. The cubs were alive, but their paws looked stiff, and one kept trying to tuck its nose under her foreleg like it had learned the only safe place was whatever warmth she could give. Walter's door opened behind me. He stepped onto the porch in a thick coat, gray hair sticking out from under a wool cap. He froze when he saw where my eyes were pointed. For a long moment, he just stood there, breath hanging in front of him. Walter Miller spoke so quietly it felt like the trees were listening. "Don't move." I didn't. The mother shifted her weight, pulling the cubs tighter. Her tail twitched, a warning without the energy to back it up. Walter set a log down on the porch as if he was placing glass. He took a few careful steps, hands open, palms visible. He wasn't creaking like a hunter. He was moving like a man approaching a skittish horse on thin ice. Walter Miller kept his voice calm. "You're in trouble, aren't you?" It sounded strange, talking to a wildcat like that. The mother's gaze locked on him. I saw the muscle in her shoulder tense, and for a second I thought she'd lunge. She didn't. One of the cubs let out a small, rasping cry. Walter's jaw tightened. He looked at the cubs, then at the sky. Walter Miller muttered, almost to himself. "Two of them." I finally spoke. I told him, "Walter, they shouldn't be here." Walter answered without looking at me. "I know." I said he needed to call wildlife services. Walter said he already did. "Roads are half shut. They won't get here today." The mother shifted again, and that's when I saw the stain in the snow near her hind leg, dark and wet under fresh flakes. She had crossed the ridge injured, and the cubs had followed because they had no other choice. Walter crouched, not close enough to touch, close enough to show he wasn't leaving. Walter Miller said I could go back if I wanted. I asked him what he was going to do. Walter said he was staying right there. The cold made my fingers numb inside my gloves. I could have turned away and told myself nature takes care of nature. The problem was, nature had already pushed this family into a man's yard. That wasn't luck. That was desperation. Walter stood and scanned his clearing like he was counting tools. The shed, the stacked logs, the pallets leaning against the fence, the deadfall branches he'd dragged in earlier. Walter Miller said he couldn't bring them inside. I agreed. No, Walter Miller said he could give them cover. He yanked open the shed door and pulled out straw, the kind he kept for traction on the porch steps. He carried it to a spot where the trees blocked some of the wind and tossed it down in a wide mound. Then he stepped back and waited. The mother watched every move. When he retreated, she lifted her head and sniffed. She didn't stand. She could in single quotes T. Walter went into the cabin and came out with a metal pan of warm water. He set it near the straw, not too close, not too far. The water steamed faintly, already losing the fight. I warned him, "Walter, this is a jaguar. Walter replied, "She's a mother, same as any other." He turned his eyes on me. Walter Miller asked if I had a phone with signal. I nodded. Walter Miller told me to call again. "Tell them it's a mother with 2 cubs, and she's injured. Tell them if they wait, they'll be collecting bodies." I walked toward the road, lifting my phone until the bars flickered. A dispatcher answered, voice tired, and I said, "Injured, cubs, storm tonight." I heard promises that didn't sound like plans. When I returned, Walter had dragged 2 long poles from the shed and was laying them against a low frame of logs. A lean-to shape, angled away from the wind. He didn't use nails. He used rope and weight and the kind of practice that comes from fixing what breaks. I said it out loud, "You're making a shelter." Walter said, "Not a house. A roof." The jaguar mother tried to rise and failed. 1 cub slid into the straw and lay still for a breath that felt too long. Then it twitched and the mother pulled it back with a weak paw. Walter saw it. For the first time I saw fear in him. Walter Miller said, "If she can't move before dark, she's done." He grabbed the battered tarp and draped it over the poles, pulling it tight, anchoring it with logs so the wind couldn't steal it. The lean-to took shape fast. It wasn't pretty. It didn't need to be. It just needed to break the wind and hold a pocket of air. He went back to the firewood stack and started selecting thick rounds. Then he carried a few flat stones from the edge of the creek bed and set them beside his stove door. I understood what he was thinking before he said it. Heap the stones, rat them, move warmth outside without bringing the animals in. A workaround, the way a man solves a problem when the rules are cruel. I told him that was dangerous. Walter Miller answered, "So is doing nothing." He glanced at the line of clouds again, and this time he didn't hide the urgency. Walter Miller said, "We've got maybe a few hours before the first real gust hits this clearing." Walter pointed toward my truck down the road. Walter Miller asked if I had extra blankets. I told him they were in the back. Walter told me to bring them. I hesitated, because that was the moment it stopped being an observation and became a commitment. A jaguar mother in pain was still a jaguar. 2 cubs meant she'd fight like nothing else. Walter spoke like the plan was already in motion. Walter Miller said, "If we leave them out there, we'll be listening to those little ones cry all night." "I'm not doing that." The wind picked up, sending a sheet of snow off his roof. The daylight felt like it was shrinking. I turned toward my truck, heart pounding. Behind me I heard Walter speak again, softer, as he stepped closer to add another armful of straw. Walter Miller said, "Easy now. I'm not taking your babies. I'm just trying to keep you alive." And the jaguar did not run. She stayed, eyes fixed on him, letting the shelter grow on her as the storm clouds rolled over the ridge. The wind reached the clearing before the snow did. It slid between the trees in short, angry bursts, lifting loose powder and throwing it against the half-built lean-to. The tarp snapped once, sharp and sudden, loud enough to make me flinch. Walter didn't even turn his head. He moved slow, not because he was unsure, but because his body demanded it. Each log he dragged left a thin, dark trail in the snow. Each bend of his back came with a quiet breath pushed through clenched teeth. This wasn't a man rushing to save something. This was a man finishing a job he had already accepted the moment he stepped off his porch. The jaguar mother watched him without blinking. Her eyes followed every step, every shift of weight. When Walter stepped forward, her muscles tightened under the spotted fur. When he stepped back, she lowered her head to the cubs and pressed her nose into their necks, breathing them in as if counting them again and again. One of the cubs shivered nonstop, small, sharp tremors running through its body. The other tried to stand, failed, and pressed closer to the mother's belly. Walter stopped near the edge of her reach. Walter Miller spoke low, his voice carried more by intent than sound. "I'm not coming closer." He slid the straw forward with the sole of his boot instead of his hands, inch by inch, keeping his balance steady. The cub nearest the edge crawled into it on instinct, burying its face and letting out a breath that fogged the air for a second. The mother tensed, muscles bunching hard enough that I thought she might strike. Then she eased when nothing touched her. Walter nodded once, a small movement, as if she had agreed to something he hadn't asked out loud. I carried the blankets from my truck, 2 thick ones, and an old quilt that smelled like oil smoke. And years of use. Walter raised a hand before I got too close. Walter Miller said, "Set them down there." I did. Every step toward the shelter felt heavier than the last. The distance between us and the jaguar felt smaller, tighter. Like the air itself was shrinking. Walter took the blankets one by one. He shook them out so slowly it was painful to watch, letting trapped snow fall away. He layered them over the straw with care, folding edges inward. Not warmth like a house would give, but a pause, a delay enough to matter when minutes turned dangerous. The mother lifted her head again. Her breathing sounded worse now, wet and uneven, like air being pulled through something torn. She tried to shift. This time she made it halfway up before her injured leg buckled under her weight. She dropped into the straw with a dull, heavy thud that made my stomach knot. Walter froze. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the jaguar, not the cubs, not us. Walter Miller said, "Easy, easy." His voice shook despite the effort to steady it. He didn't step closer. He didn't step away. He waited until her breathing slowed, until the cubs settled again, before he carefully backed off. The sky darkened faster than it should have. Storm clouds swallowed what little light was left, turning afternoon into something closer to evening. Snow began to fall in heavy flakes, the kind that don't drift or dance. They land and stay. The tarp sagged as weight gathered on it. Walter adjusted the poles, lifting the tarp higher, tying it off again with practiced knots. His fingers were stiff and red at the knuckles. When one knot slipped free, he didn't curse or rush. He simply retied it, slower, tighter. I asked him how long he planned to stay up there. Walter answered without looking up, "Until she settles." I asked, "What if she doesn't?" Walter paused and looked at the cubs. Walter Miller said, "Then I stay longer." He carried the heated stones wrapped in thick cloth, setting them near the back wall of the shelter, where the cubs couldn't reach them. Steam rose briefly, then vanished into the cold. The mother sniffed, confused by the unfamiliar warmth, ears twitching. Walter stepped away again, palms open, shoulders loose. Walter Miller said, "That's all I've got for tonight." Snow fell harder. The world narrowed to the shelter, the jaguar family, and the old man standing guard like he was keeping a promise no one else knew about. A branch cracked under the growing weight and fell somewhere in the woods. The sound echoed. "That?" Mother flinched, pulling the cubs tighter. One cub let out a thin cry, weak but sharp enough to cut through the storm and straight through me. Walter's shoulders sagged. Walter Miller said, "I know." He backed away toward the porch, never turning his back. When he reached the steps, he sat down heavily, breaths shaking out of him. His hands trembled now that they weren't busy. I asked him if he was scared. Walter looked at me like the question caught him off guard. Walter Miller said, "Of course I am." He rubbed his palms together, trying to bring feeling back into them. Walter Miller said, "I'm just not more scared than they are." Night came early and hard. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the tarp, testing every knot and rope. Snow piled against the shelter walls, sealing gaps Walter hadn't planned for. The lean-to held. Walter refused to go inside. He sat on the porch with a lantern, its light shaking in the wind, watching the shelter through blowing snow. I stood with him for a while, stamping my feet, shifting my weight to keep the cold from climbing too far up my legs. I told him he couldn't stay out all night. Walter answered, "Watch me." Sometime after dark, the mother shifted again. This time she managed to crawl fully under the tarp, dragging the cubs with her, using what strength she had left. They disappeared into the straw and blankets, leaving only her head visible at the entrance, eyes half-lidded but alert. Walter leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Walter Miller said, "Good." The word carried more weight than it should have. Hours passed. The storm screamed itself hoarse, Snow crept higher against the porch steps. The lantern burned low, the flame shrinking. Near midnight, I told Walter I had to leave before the road closed completely. Walter nodded. Walter Miller said, "Come back in the morning." I hesitated. Then asked what if wildlife services arrived overnight. Walter didn't answer right away. "Walter," Miller said, "then we'll talk." Before I left, the mother lifted her head and looked straight at him. Not a challenge, not fear, just awareness. Walter held her gaze. Walter Miller said, "I won't touch them." The jaguar didn't move. As I drove away, the shelter stood between the trees like a small, stubborn thing pushing back against winter. It wasn't a miracle. It was a line drawn in the snow. And once you draw a line like that, there's no pretending it doesn't exist. 2 days after the storm, the world looked calm in a way that felt dishonest. The sky was a hard winter blue, and the snow had stopped long enough to show the damage. A few trees were down across the service road. Drifts leaned against the trunks like frozen waves. Walter's porch steps were half buried again. I got there just after sunrise. My truck crawled the last mile, tires grinding on ice. I expected quiet. Instead, I heard Walter chopping. He stood near his woodpile with an axe in his hand, splitting smaller kindling with the same steady rhythm he used for everything. Not fast, not angry, just a man keeping order in a place that never stays ordered. Walter Miller glanced up when he saw me. Walter Miller said, "Road's open." I nodded. Walter Miller said, "Good. Then they might actually come." He didn't need to say who. The lean-to was still there, half buried along the sides where snow had packed itself in. The tarp held, the rope held. The shelter looked like it had grown out of the clearing, rough and stubborn. Walter walked me closer, slow, stopping well short of the entrance. Inside, the jaguar mother lifted her head. She didn't try to rise. That alone told me the pain was still winning. But her breathing sounded different, less wet, less frantic. The cubs were pressed against her belly, their bodies tucked deep into straw and blankets. One cub blinked at the light and shifted, clumsy but awake. Walter Miller spoke low. "They made it through the first night." I asked if she drank. Walter nodded. Walter Miller said, "A little." I set the pan farther back so she could reach without feeling trapped. He pointed to the snow near the shelter. Walter Miller said, "She moved herself in when it got bad. I didn't touch them." I believe him. The only prints near the entrance were Walter's boots. Always stopping at the same invisible line, we stood there in the cold for a while, watching the mother's eyes move between us and the trees. Her gaze was sharp again, not strong but present. The cubs made small sounds, half sighs, half whimpers, then settled. Walter Miller said, "I called them every few hours." I asked if anyone answered. Walter Miller said, "Same tired voice, same promises." He rubbed his hands together, then surprised me by smiling, the smallest crack in his usual stone face. Walter Miller said, "I told them they could argue with me later. Just get here around midday." The sound of an engine climbed the road. A stake truck eased into the clearing, tires crunching. A man in a heavy jacket stepped out, followed by another in a knit cap carrying a case. The first one introduced himself. "Ranger Cole," said Walter Miller. Walter nodded. Walter Miller said, "Over there." Cole didn't approach like someone coming to take control. He approached like someone stepping into a situation that could turn dangerous if pride got involved. Ranger Cole asked if anyone had been feeding her. Walter answered, "No, water, straw, blankets, warm stones, placed where the cubs can't reach." The second man, calm and quiet, knelt and studied the shelter from a distance. "Dr. Harris said you did the right thing." Walter didn't react like he wanted praise. He just kept watching the mother. "Drive?" Harris asked about the injury. Walter pointed at the hind leg. Walter Miller said, "Blood in the snow. She crossed the ridge, hurt." Dr. Harris nodded once. Dr. Harris said, "We need to get her somewhere warm, then sedate safely. In this cold, she burns energy just staying alive." Ranger Cole looked at Walter. Ranger Cole said, "We have a heated transport crate in the truck. We can take all three together. Walter's shoulders lowered a fraction. Walter Miller said the cubs stay with her. Ranger Cole said they will. The plan was simple and careful. No sudden moves. No crowding. No touching unless necessary. They set the crate behind the shelter, out of her direct line of sight, and warned at first. Drive Harris prepared a dart with a dose meant to calm, not drop her hard. The ranger watched the trees and the wind like he didn't trust either. Dr. Harris spoke as if he was explaining to the jaguar. Not to us. Drive Harris said, this will make you sleepy. We're not hurting you. Walter stood next to me, hands open, quiet. Walter Miller said, easy. The dart hit the thick muscle of her shoulder. She snapped her head up, eyes blazing. And for a moment, every instinct in me said run. She didn't run. She pulled the cubs tighter, shielding them with her body, and held her ground until her legs began to tremble. Even when her strength faded, she kept her head up long enough to watch the cubs crawl into her chest. When she finally sank into the straw, Dr. Harris moved in fast, checking her breathing, keeping her airway clear. Ranger Cole lifted one cub gently, supporting its belly and chest, then placed it in the crate. The second cub followed, smaller, quieter. Dr. Harris and Cole moved the mother last, using a sling, keeping her body level, never dragging. Walter watched every step. Walter Miller asked if she would wake up. Drive Harris said she will, and she'll wake up warm. Ranger Cole checked the mother's neck and frowned. Ranger Cole said she has a scar where a collar used to be. Drive Harris ran a scanner along her shoulder. Drive Harris said there's a chip. Ranger Cole's face tightened. Ranger Cole said that means she's not wild. She's someone's animal. Walter's jaw set. Walter Miller said someone let her end up here. No one argued. They loaded the crate into the truck. Before the doors closed, the mother's eyes opened once, heavy and slow. She looked past the crate bars, past the men, and locked on Walter. Walter stepped closer than he had in days, still not close enough to touch. Walter Miller said, go on. Take your kids. The truck pulled away, leaving tracks that filled in behind it. A week later, the weather softened. The wind changed direction. The nights still bit, but not the same way. Walter took the shelter down piece by piece. He stacked the poles, folded the tarp, and carried the straw to the edge of the tree line where deer sometimes bedded down. He didn't keep the lean-to as a monument. He treated it like a tool that had done its job. When I asked him how he felt, he shrugged. Walter Miller said, tired. I asked if he regretted it. Walter looked at the empty patch of snow where the shelter had been. Walter Miller said, if you can do a thing and you don't, that stays with you. A few days after that, a call came to his landline. Ranger Cole's voice sounded different, lighter. Ranger Cole said surgery went well. The leg will heal. The cubs are eating. They're together. Walter didn't say anything for a long moment. Walter Miller said, good. That was all. When he hung up, he went back outside and started clearing the porch again. The same steady rhythm, the same quiet work. The snow kept falling. The forest kept being the forest. But in that clearing, where two worlds had touched for a brief, dangerous stretch of time, Walter had drawn his line and held it. Not for thanks, not for a story. Just because leaving them to freeze would have been the kind of thing a man never really walks away from.
Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories. And now just click the playlist or the next video on your screen.